Good day, everyone! London Onion here, returning with another Invader Prime build, receiving an Onion approval for the Apocalypse difficulty. Now, after previously showcasing one potential build with the Hunter, it almost felt like a natural progression to the Gunslinger, which will be the accompanying archetype for today's exposition. Now, it wouldn't be surprising to this Onion if the Gunslinger were also a popular choice. But regardless, they seem like a logical pairing, given their core strategies for survival. The Invader is all about misdirection and evasion, and the Gunslinger is oriented to firearm efficiency and ammo maintenance. Now, their synergy does not seem obvious from this brief expo, but from a practical perspective, they seem to work similarly to our Eternal Spectre. There is less stealth and more dynamic offense. If the Hunter is the outfighter, then the Gunslinger is the infighter of ranged combat. Despite the Invaders and Gunslingers' opposing strategies for combat, this Onion would argue that they can still act as a complement to each other. This we will break down, starting with the build. Similarly to our previous video, this Onion does not have a prescriptive armor set, but we maximize our armor effectiveness with a mixture of the Bruiser and Leto Mark II armor constituents. Our relic of choice is the Pulsing Heart, which replenishes 20 health units every 3 seconds for 15 seconds. As a close second, the Void Heart is also a viable option. The shards I equip are armor effectiveness, ammo pickups, and consumable use speed. Moving on to the weapons, the primary comes down to 2 options and different mutators. Either the Royal Hunting Bow or the tried and true Bonesaw LMG. For the Hunting Bow, this Onion equips the Supercharger mutator. Meanwhile, the Bonesaw would be equipped with Momentum. Both will enhance critical chance, though Momentum would be slightly superior over time. Contrary to what would probably be a more popular choice, this Onion actually favors the Royal Hunting Bow for this build. The rationale we'll touch on later in the discussion. Our mod of choice is Scrapshot for both weapons. As for the secondary, I equip the MP60 with the Tremor mod and the Sleeper mutator, for increased critical chance and critical damage for 10 seconds after being stowed for 5 seconds. The melee weapon is purely up to preference, but this Onion decided on the Abyssal Hook with the Edgelord mutator. Transitioning to the jewelry, the amulet leading this build is the Full Moon Circlet, which grants 3% of base range damage dealt as lifesteal. At full health, range damage is increased by 25%. As for our rings, I equip the Probability Cord, Braided Thorns, Sapphire Dreamstone, and Celerity Stone. Probability Cord increases critical damage by 20%, Braided Thorns increases critical chance by 10%, Sapphire Dreamstone reduces skill cooldowns by 4% for every critical hit, and this comes with a 2-second cooldown. Lastly, Celerity Stone increases relic/consumable use speed by 25%. For the skills, on the Invader side, I employ Reboot, and for the Gunslinger, I primarily employ the trusty Quick Draw skill. As a close second, I would go with Bulletstorm for the increased critical chance that comes with using a bow. Quick Draw has 2 firing options, and both are guaranteed to be critical. Bulletstorm maximizes the Gunslinger's prowess with weapon readiness and efficiency, with increased reload speed and fire rate. Lastly, for our traits, I take the Engineer's Fortify, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Barkskin, Footwork, Recovery, and either Siphoner or Fitness. If employing the Bonesaw, then it would be between Siphoner and Handling. Now, I'm pretty sure I've made some questionable choices with this build, but trust this Onion when he says there is some logic to it, which we will explore through discussing the application and limitations. So I think it is important to provide some context for our critical illusionist, starting with the meta. The Invader is primarily a defensive archetype. The Gunslinger, on the other hand, is mainly offensive, but the nature of the offense is worth exploring. As stated earlier, this Onion would frame the Gunslinger as the infighter of ranged combat. At the same time, the Gunslinger is not known for heightened burst damage, but instead increased frequency with an extended capacity. What this would imply is that the Gunslinger is an archetype of dynamic attrition. Metaphorically speaking, if the Hunter is a one-trick pony sniper, then the Gunslinger is the adaptable machine gun. Chances are, when engaging enemies, the Gunslinger is likely to be in the thick of combat, and despite the Invader being primarily defensive, they are also at their best when in close with their enemies. Close to mid-range will pave the way for optimal use of their decoys. With this in mind, we'll speak on the intended use of this build and our choices regarding the build constituents. Using a pairing where both seem to function best when closer to enemies will require a user that is either untouchable or one that has some cushion in the event of blunders. This onion prefers to err on the side of caution and will consequently favor heavier armor for greater protection. Use of decoys and the Invader's Circumvent perk should sufficiently reduce stress on stamina reserves. Now initially, I favored the Bone Saw, but through experimenting, there were greater occurrences of becoming overwhelmed with too many enemies. With a loud profile weapon, more enemies are likely to be drawn in. This in and of itself is not a problem. The problem lies with the amount of time spent per target. Despite these two performing best as a dynamic pair, there still has to be a balance between targets eliminated and new targets incoming. This is most notable with hordes of weak enemies. Plus, the Invader is not necessarily oriented to enemy elimination, but instead misdirection. Consequently, most of the offensive load falls on the Gunslinger, hence this onion opted for a greater burst damage weapon with the Royal Hunting Bow. There is more stress per target since it's a single shot weapon, but the stress is reduced if they are closer. Now the decoys are still an integral tool for the success of this pairing, but so is remaining at full health. When outnumbered or outgunned, it is appropriate to activate the Invader's reboot skill for the initial misdirection. This will allow the Gunslinger to employ their offense with reduced stress of enemy retaliation. It is then paramount to consume a relic and perform an evasion when attention has returned to the user. This will leave a longer lasting decoy, and consequently more time for critical offense. Rinse and repeat until the skill nears its expiration, then consume a relic and reactivate reboot. This leads us into our relic and amulet choices. The Pulsing Heart heals at 3-second intervals and can act as a failsafe in the event one takes damage during and after the reboot phase. Because of how it heals, mixed with the lifesteal of Full Moon Circlet, the Siphoner trait, and potentially the Invader's Loophole, remaining at full health is made a lot easier. The benefits of full health is the damage bonus awarded by Full Moon Circlet. This is why Void Heart was a close second. It can heal 100% of one's health, but the effect becomes nearly useless if one takes damage after its activation. The Pulsing Heart is intended to counteract this potential limitation with interval healing over the course of 15 seconds. As a small bonus, the Gunslinger gains an additional 15% range damage for 10 seconds upon consuming a relic. Now, reboot does not have to be an answer for every enemy encounter. With the bow as our primary, the MP60 serves as a balance with its ease of use, and the Sleeper Mutator turns it into a perfect sidearm for quick and frequent critical hits for activating Sapphire Dreamstone. With fully automatic use, the MP60 can knock off 4% of cooldown time at least 4 times, and this only takes 5 seconds to cool down and repeat again. Quick Draw serves as a tertiary and dynamic offensive option. All of the shots are critical, and have effectively 100% accuracy if used correctly. I favor this skill over Bulletstorm strictly for those reasons. When outnumbered by both ground and airborne targets, for example, having to switch between them or prioritize one over the other can add unnecessary stress in combat and lead to damage received. Quick Draw can address both, or can eliminate one with the hold and release firing option, though personally, I find this most useful for elites or slightly tougher but common targets. It is important to touch on our chosen mods. They are ultimately intended to slow enemy progression while inflicting a significant amount of damage. Their use makes enemy evasion far easier, and can stand with or in place of decoys should one's skills be on cooldown. And this is particularly important because one major limitation is that decoys are not perfect. It can be easy to fall into the habit of being less reactive just because a decoy is on the field. Usually, they are pretty good with diverting enemy attention, but all it takes is one oversight of an undistracted target to put one in a jeopardizing circumstance. Another limitation, it takes rather specific circumstances for the damage output to be optimized for this pairing. The Invader's Shark perk requires one to be mobile to build up damage. The Gunslinger requires a relic for a nice damage boost. Our Illusionist has to be at full health for the damage boost of their amulet, and critical damage points, though not difficult to achieve with this build, are the main numbers to look out for. Regular numbers are really nothing spectacular. As a byproduct, one will likely spend a good amount of time maneuvering around their targets or maintaining offense while on the retreat. The Invader and Gunslinger, with the way I have chosen to decorate them, create an ultimate kiter, for those that are familiar with the term. But again, this is not a build of fast carnage like the Hunter, but a build of dynamic attrition. Now I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.